The fluorescent lights of City General Hospital buzzed overhead as Rebecca wiped down the nurse's station. Her feet ached in her worn-out sneakers, the ones she'd been meaning to replace for 6 months but couldn't afford. The clock showed 11:47 p.m. Her shift had started at 7 a.m. and she still had paperwork to finish. Rebecca was 28, but some days she felt twice that age. Being an emergency room nurse wasn't just a job. It was everything she'd wanted to do. Even as a little girl, she'd dreamed of helping people. But nobody had told her how expensive that dream would be, or how hard it would become just to survive while living it. The student loans were the worst part. Every month, a huge chunk of her paycheck vanished. Rent took most of what remained, leaving her to carefully budget every dollar for food and transportation. She'd stopped going out with friends months ago. Coffee shops felt like luxuries from another lifetime. Even buying new scrubs seemed impossible when her bank account hovered near zero. Tonight had been particularly rough. 3 car accident victims, 2 cardiac arrests, and 1 teenager who'd overdosed. Rebecca had held that boy's mother while she sobbed in the waiting room. The mother had grabbed her hand so tightly, looking into her eyes like Rebecca held all the answers. These moments reminded Rebecca why she kept going. Why she picked up extra shifts even when exhaustion blurred her vision. Why she smiled at patients even when her own world was crumbling. Because in those rooms, in those desperate moments, she was exactly where she needed to be. Finally, at midnight, Rebecca clocked out. She pulled her thin jacket tighter as she stepped into the November night. The temperature had dropped and dark clouds promised rain. Checking the weather and being able to afford a proper winter coat were 2 different things. The bus stop was 6 blocks away. Rebecca usually didn't mind the walk. It gave her time to decompress. But tonight, with the cold wind cutting through her jacket and raindrops beginning to fall, those 6 blocks felt like 6 miles. She walked quickly, her sneakers splashing through puddles. The streets were mostly empty. Rebecca kept her head down, focused on getting home. That's when she saw him. At first, she almost walked right past. He was huddled against the wall behind a convenience store, partially hidden by the dumpster. Most people probably wouldn't have noticed him in the darkness and rain, but Rebecca's eyes were trained to spot distress. And everything about this scene screamed that something was very wrong. The man looked elderly, maybe in his 60s. His clothes were torn and filthy, layers of ragged jackets that had lost their original color. He was shivering violently. Even from several feet away, Rebecca could see his lips had a bluish tint. She stopped walking. Her tired brain ran through symptoms. Hypothermia, possible malnutrition. The sensible part of her mind whispered that she should call 911 and keep walking. She'd already given everything at the hospital. She was exhausted, freezing, and broke. But Rebecca had never been good at listening to the sensible part of her mind. She approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. As she got closer, she could hear his breathing shallow and raspy. His eyes were closed. Then his eyelids fluttered open, revealing tired, confused eyes that struggled to focus. Rebecca knelt beside him, ignoring the cold pavement soaking through her scrubs. She checked his pulse. Weak, but steady. His skin was ice cold. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked gently. "My name is Rebecca. I'm a nurse. You're going to be okay." The man's eyes focused on her. He tried to speak, but his teeth chattered too hard to form words. Rebecca made a quick decision. She stood and hurried into the convenience store. The young clerk looked up, surprised. Rebecca grabbed hot soup, the cheapest blanket she could find, and some first aid items. Her hands shook as she pulled out her wallet. $43. Everything she had until her next paycheck in 4 days. She'd planned to buy groceries tomorrow. Actual groceries, not just instant noodles. Maybe some fruit. Definitely coffee for another double shift. Rebecca stared at the bills. Then she handed them to the clerk. Some decisions aren't really decisions at all. They're just who you are. And Rebecca had never been the kind of person who could walk away from someone who needed help, no matter what it cost her. She rushed back outside. Carefully, she helped the man sit up and wrapped the blanket around him. Then she opened the soup, testing the temperature, and held the cup while he took small, shaky sips. They sat there together in the rain behind a dumpster. A broke nurse and a homeless man. 2 people the world had largely forgotten, finding each other in the darkest hour. As the man slowly sipped the soup, some color returned to his face. His shivering decreased. Rebecca checked him over in the dim light. No obvious injuries, but he was severely undernourished. "What's your name?" she asked softly. "James," he said, his voice rough but clear now. "Thank you for stopping." Most people don't even look. Rebecca felt her heart squeeze. How many people had walked past him tonight? She understood it. Everyone had their own problems. The world made it easy to become numb to other people's pain. But that didn't make it right. "How long have you been out here?" "Tonight?" "Few hours," James replied. "In general?" "Long enough." Something about how he spoke caught her attention. His words were articulate, educated even. She'd worked with enough homeless patients to know anyone could end up on the streets through bad luck or circumstances beyond their control. "I should call an ambulance," Rebecca said. "You need proper medical attention." "No hospitals," James said firmly, panic flashing across his face. "Please, no insurance, no money. The bills would destroy me." Rebecca hesitated. She knew the medical debt crisis. She'd seen patients refuse necessary care because they couldn't afford it. The system was broken. "At least let me make sure you're stable," she said. "Then promise me you'll go to the shelter on 5th Street. They have beds, hot meals, and a nurse on staff. Promise me." James looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I promise." They sat there for another half hour. Rebecca monitored his condition. She gave him detailed directions to the shelter and made him repeat them back. The rain began to let up. When Rebecca felt confident James was stable, she helped him to his feet. He was stronger than she'd expected. She adjusted the blanket around his shoulders. "Wait," she said, unwrapping her own scarf. It wasn't much, just a cheap knitted thing from a thrift store, but it was warm. She wrapped it around James's neck. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the last $20 bill from her wallet. Her bus money for the entire week. She pressed it into James's hand. "For a hot meal at the shelter," she said, "and maybe some new socks. Dry socks are important." "I can't take this," James protested. "You've already done so much." "You can and you will," Rebecca said firmly. "Consider it nurse's orders." James's eyes filled with tears. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Rebecca thought about that question. She could give many reasons, but the real answer was simpler. "Because you're not a stranger," she said quietly. "You're a person, and people take care of each other. That's how we survive." She watched as James made his way down the street toward the shelter. He turned back once to wave, and Rebecca waved back, standing in the rain until he disappeared. Only then did she start the long walk home. Her feet hurt worse than before. Her clothes were soaked. She had no money for the bus, no money for groceries, and she'd just given away her only scarf. Tomorrow she'd have to figure out how to make instant noodles last 4 days. But as Rebecca walked through the quiet streets, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. A quiet certainty that some things mattered more than money, more than comfort, more than playing it safe. Rebecca had no way of knowing that the man she'd helped wasn't what he appeared to be. She couldn't have guessed that this random act of kindness would ripple out in ways she couldn't imagine. She was just a broke nurse trying to make it through another day, one small act of compassion at a time. But life has a funny way of rewarding those who give without expecting anything in return. And Rebecca's story was only just beginning. 3 weeks passed since that rainy night. Rebecca had almost forgotten about James. Almost, but not quite. Sometimes during her shifts she'd wonder if he made it to the shelter, if he was warm, if he was eating. But life had a way of pulling her attention back to her own mounting problems. The eviction notice was real now. Her landlord had given her until the end of the month, which was just 5 days away. Rebecca had been looking at cheaper apartments, but even the worst ones required a security deposit she didn't have. She'd started packing her things into boxes, not sure where she'd be taking them. Maybe her car, if it came to that. Work had become her only refuge. At the hospital, surrounded by people who needed her, she could forget about her own troubles. She could focus on saving lives, comforting families, making a difference. It was the only place where she still felt like she had value. It was a Thursday afternoon when everything changed. Rebecca had just finished her lunch break when one of the front desk staff called out to her, "Rebecca, there's someone here to see you in the main lobby." Rebecca frowned. She wasn't expecting anyone. Her parents lived 3 states away, and she barely had any friends left in the city. Most had drifted away when she'd stopped being able to afford going out. She walked toward the lobby, her mind running through possibilities. Maybe it was her landlord. The main lobby was always busy. Families waiting for news, patients checking in, medical staff rushing between departments. Rebecca scanned the crowd looking for a familiar face, and then she saw him. At first, she didn't recognize him at all. The man standing near the information desk wore an expensive suit, perfectly tailored. His shoes were polished to a shine. His silver hair was neatly styled. He stood with the confidence of someone who belonged in boardrooms. Next to him stood a younger woman holding a leather briefcase, but then the man turned and his eyes met hers. Those eyes. She recognized those eyes. "James?" Rebecca said, barely above a whisper. The man smiled. "Hello, Rebecca. I've been hoping to find you." Rebecca walked closer, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. This couldn't be the same person. This man looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine, but those eyes, that voice, they were unmistakable. "I don't understand," Rebecca stammered. "What happened? Are you okay?" "I'm more than okay," James said warmly. "Thanks to you. Is there somewhere we could talk? Somewhere private?" Rebecca glanced at her watch. She still had 20 minutes left on her break. "There's a conference room on the second floor. Follow me." As they walked through the corridors, Rebecca's mind raced. She was acutely aware of her worn scrubs next to this impossibly well-dressed man. She led them to a small empty room and closed the door. "Please sit," James said. The woman placed the briefcase on the table but remained standing. Rebecca sat, feeling like she was in a dream. "James, what's going on? You look so different." James took a deep breath. "Rebecca, I owe you an explanation. My full name is James Wellington. I'm a retired real estate developer. What you saw that night wasn't an accident. I was living on the streets intentionally." Rebecca blinked. "Intentionally? Why would anyone do that?" "My wife died 2 years ago," James said, and the polished exterior cracked, revealing genuine pain. "Catherine, we'd been married for 38 years. After she passed, I realized I'd been living in a bubble. Wealth, privilege, comfort. I'd lost touch with what real struggle looked like. What real compassion looked like." He paused, looking down at his hands. "Catherine always believed in the goodness of people. She volunteered at shelters, donated to charities, saw the best in everyone. After she died, I became cynical. I started to think that kindness was dead, that people only cared about themselves. So I decided to test that theory." "You went undercover?" Rebecca asked, still trying to process this information. "For 3 months," James confirmed. "I lived on the streets, experienced homelessness firsthand. And in those 3 months, do you know how many people stopped to help? How many people even looked at me like I was human?" Rebecca shook her head. "One," James said, his eyes locked on hers. "You, one person in 3 months. Hundreds, maybe thousands of people walked past me. They ignored me, avoided me, some even insulted me. But you stopped. You used your last money to help a stranger. You gave me your scarf, your bus fare. You sat with me in the rain." Rebecca felt her cheeks flush. "I'm a nurse. It's what I do." "No," James said firmly. "Plenty of nurses walked past me during those 3 months. Plenty of doctors. Plenty of people who've taken oaths to help others. But they didn't stop, you did. And not because of your job, but because of who you are." The woman by the door opened the briefcase and pulled out a folder. James took it and slid it across the table to Rebecca. "What's this?" Rebecca asked. "Open it." With trembling hands, Rebecca opened the folder. Inside were documents, official-looking papers with her name on them. She started reading, but the words didn't make sense at first. Student loan statements, with 0 balances, a car title paid in full, and a check made out to her for an amount that made her gasp out loud. "I don't understand," Rebecca whispered, looking up at James with wide eyes. "Your student loans are paid off," James said gently. "Your car is yours, free and clear. And that check is to help you get back on your feet. Find a decent apartment, maybe take a vacation, buy some new scrubs." Rebecca's hands shook so badly she had to put the papers down. "I can't accept this. This is too much. I did what anyone would do." "But they didn't," James said, leaning forward. "That's the point, Rebecca. You did what anyone should do, but almost no one does anymore. You saw a human being in need and you helped even though you were struggling yourself. Even though you had every reason to walk away." Tears started streaming down Rebecca's face. She couldn't stop them. All the stress of the past months, the fear, the exhaustion, the constant worry about money. It all came pouring out. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. "I'm sorry," she managed to say between sobs. "I'm sorry, I've been so scared. I'm being evicted and I didn't know what I was going to do. And I still come here every day trying to help people when I can't even help myself." She felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. When she looked up, James was standing beside her, his own eyes glistening with tears. "You don't have to be scared anymore," he said softly. "Let me help you the way you helped me. Please. It would mean everything to me." Rebecca looked at the papers on the table, then back at James. This man she'd met for maybe an hour on the worst night of both their lives. This stranger who'd turned out to be anything but. "Why?" she asked, echoing the question he'd asked her that rainy night. "Why would you do this for me?" James smiled, and she saw in that smile the same gratitude she'd seen in his eyes 3 weeks ago, when she'd wrapped her scarf around his neck. "Because you're not a stranger," he said, using her own words. "You're a person, and people take care of each other. That's how we survive." In that moment, in that small conference room in City General Hospital, Rebecca understood that her life had just changed forever. Not just because of the money, though that would certainly help, but because she'd been reminded of something important. Sometimes the universe does pay attention, sometimes kindness does come back around, and sometimes helping someone in their darkest hour means they'll be there to help you through yours. Rebecca accepted James's help that day. She didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning of a friendship that would change both their lives in ways neither could have imagined. The weeks that followed were strange for Rebecca. Strange in a good way, but strange nonetheless. Her student loans were gone. The crushing weight that had pressed down on her shoulders for years had vanished. She'd found a nice apartment with heating that worked and windows that didn't leak. She could afford real groceries now with fresh vegetables and fruit. But the strangest part was James. He kept showing up. At first, Rebecca thought the hospital visit would be the end of it. He'd paid off her debts, given her money to get back on her feet, and she'd thanked him. She'd assumed that would be it. Rich people didn't stay friends with broke nurses. That wasn't how the world worked, except James didn't seem to know that rule. The first time he showed up at the hospital cafeteria, Rebecca thought it was a coincidence. She was grabbing lunch between shifts when she spotted him at a corner table, 2 cups of coffee in front of him. He waved her over with a smile. "I hope you don't mind," James said as she approached. "I got you a coffee. I remember you mentioned you'd run out that night and I thought you might need one." Rebecca sat down, still uncertain. "You didn't have to do that. You've already done so much. I wanted to," James said simply. "I was hoping we could talk. If you have time." They talked for her entire break. James asked about her work, seemed genuinely interested in her cases. He told her about his late wife, Catherine, how she'd been a teacher with the same compassionate heart. How she would have liked Rebecca. When Rebecca's break ended, she felt disappointed. The next week, he was there again. Same table, same 2 cups of coffee. This time, they talked about books. Rebecca mentioned she hadn't been able to afford new books in years. 2 days later, a package arrived at her apartment. 5 bestsellers she'd mentioned wanting to read. The note inside said, "Everyone deserves new stories, James." This pattern continued. James would show up once or twice a week at the cafeteria. Sometimes he'd bring lunch. They'd talk about everything. He told her about his business days, the buildings he'd developed. But he also talked about his regrets, his loneliness after Catherine died, how empty his big house felt. Rebecca found herself looking forward to these visits. James was easy to talk to. He listened in a way most people didn't. He asked questions and actually cared about the answers. He made her laugh with stories about his attempts to learn cooking. Apparently, even scrambled eggs were a challenge. But Rebecca was also confused. She couldn't figure out what James wanted from her. This wasn't romantic. He was 62, she was 28. But why would a multi-millionaire want to spend his free time having coffee with an overworked nurse? She was afraid to ask, worried that questioning it might make it stop. These lunches had become the highlight of her week. 3 months after that first hospital visit, James invited her to dinner. A real dinner, at an upscale restaurant Rebecca had only seen from the outside. She almost said no. She didn't have clothes for a place like that. But James insisted, telling her to come as she was. The restaurant was beautiful. Soft lighting, fresh flowers on every table. Rebecca felt out of place in her simple dress and cardigan. but James greeted her warmly and immediately put her at ease. "I want to talk to you about something," James said after they'd ordered. His tone was serious, and Rebecca felt her stomach drop. This was it. Whatever this strange friendship had been, it was ending. "Okay," she said quietly. "I've been thinking a lot these past few months," James began. "About my life, about what matters, about what Catherine would want me to do with the time I have left. And I've realized something important." He paused. "I've spent my whole life building things. Buildings, businesses, wealth. But none of it means anything. The only time I've felt truly alive since Catherine died was that night when you helped me. And these past few months getting to know you have been the happiest I've been in years." Rebecca's heart was beating fast. "I want to start a foundation," James continued. "A non-profit dedicated to helping homeless individuals get back on their feet. Medical care, job training, housing assistance. I want to call it the Catherine Foundation after my wife." "That's wonderful," Rebecca said. She would have loved that. "I want you to help me run it," James said. Rebecca blinked. "What?" "I have the money and the business experience," James explained. "But I don't have what you have. I don't have the compassion, the understanding of what people really need." "I need someone who cares as much as you do." "James, I'm not qualified for something like that," Rebecca protested. "I'm a nurse, not a nonprofit manager." "You can learn the management part," James said. "I can't teach someone to care the way you do. Think about the impact we could make together. We could change lives, Rebecca. Hundreds, maybe thousands of lives." Rebecca looked down at her hands. This was crazy, but as she thought about it, something stirred in her chest. Hope. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Of course," James said, smiling. "Take all the time you need." But Rebecca was already thinking about it. She was thinking about all the people like James she'd seen on the streets. All the patients she'd treated in the ER who were homeless, who needed so much more than a bandage and some antibiotics. All the times she'd wished she could do more but had been limited by the system, by resources, by time. What if she could actually do more? What if this was why she'd stopped that night? Not just to help one man, but to start something bigger? Over the next few weeks, Rebecca and James met regularly to discuss the foundation. He showed her properties he owned that could be converted into shelters. They toured existing facilities to see what worked and what didn't. James introduced her to lawyers, accountants, and nonprofit consultants. He was serious about this, and his enthusiasm was infectious. But something else was happening too, something neither of them had expected. The more time they spent together, the more Rebecca realized how much she enjoyed James's company. Not just as a friend or a potential business partner, but as a person. He made her laugh. He challenged her ideas in ways that made her think deeper. He respected her opinions, valued her input, and James, for his part, found himself thinking about Rebecca constantly. The way she lit up when she talked about helping people, her terrible jokes that somehow still made him smile. The way she'd argue with him when she thought he was wrong, not intimidated by his wealth or his age. One evening, as they sat in James's home office going over foundation plans, James looked up from the spreadsheets and just watched Rebecca as she concentrated on a budget proposal. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She was wearing jeans and an old sweater. She was chewing on her pen the way she always did when she was thinking hard. And James realized with a jolt that felt like electricity that he was falling in love with her. It terrified him. He was 34 years older than her. What could he possibly offer her except money, which she'd already proven didn't matter much to her? She had her whole life ahead of her. She should be with someone young, someone who could give her children and decades together. But his heart didn't care about logic. His heart only knew that Rebecca made him feel alive again. That when he was with her, he wasn't just a lonely widower passing time. He was himself again, maybe even a better version of himself. James didn't say anything that night. He wasn't sure he'd ever say anything. But the feeling was there, growing stronger every day, impossible to ignore. And though Rebecca didn't realize it yet, she was beginning to feel something too. Something that confused her, that seemed impossible, but that whispered to her heart every time James smiled at her. Sometimes the best things in life start with the smallest acts of kindness, and sometimes those acts lead to places you never imagined you'd go. Rebecca said yes to the foundation. How could she not? The opportunity to help people on a scale she'd never imagined was too important to pass up. She gave her notice at the hospital, and her coworkers threw her a small goodbye party. They were happy for her, even if they couldn't quite believe her story. The first few months working with James were intense. There was so much to learn. Legal documents, properties to inspect, staff to hire. Rebecca felt overwhelmed sometimes, but James was always patient. He'd explain things as many times as she needed, never making her feel stupid for asking. They converted one of James's old office buildings into the Foundation's first shelter. 30 beds, a full kitchen, a medical clinic, and spaces for job training. Rebecca worked with architects and contractors, making sure every detail was right. She wanted the space to feel dignified, not institutional. The Catherine Foundation opened on a Saturday in April. The local news covered it. James gave a speech about his late wife and her belief in helping others. Then he called Rebecca to the microphone. She spoke from her heart about seeing people as people, not problems to be solved. That first night, they had 12 residents. By the end of the month, all 30 beds were full. Rebecca hired 2 nurses and a social worker. She was there almost every day, talking to residents, helping them navigate the system. This was what she'd been meant to do all along, and through it all, James was there. Not just as her boss or partner, but as her friend, her best friend. They'd have dinner together after long days. They'd sit in his office late into the evening, planning new programs. He'd make her laugh when she was stressed. She'd remind him to eat when he got too focused on work. Rebecca's friends started asking questions. "What's going on with you and this James guy?" Her former coworker Lisa asked over coffee. "You talk about him constantly." "We're just friends," Rebecca said automatically. "He's like a mentor." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "A mentor who brings you flowers on your birthday? Who texts you good morning every day?" Rebecca felt her cheeks flush. "He does not look at me like that." "Girl, he absolutely does," Lisa said, laughing. "And honestly, you look at him the same way." That conversation stuck with Rebecca. She started paying attention to how she felt around James, the way her heart would skip when she saw his name on her phone, how she'd catch herself watching him when he wasn't looking, the warmth that spread through her chest when he praised her work. Was she falling for him? The thought seemed ridiculous. He was 62. She was 28. People would judge them. They'd say she was after his money. But her heart didn't care about any of that. Her heart only knew that James made her happier than anyone ever had. James was having similar thoughts. His feelings for Rebecca had been growing for months, but he'd kept them buried. He had no right to feel this way about someone so young, so full of life. But denying his feelings was becoming impossible. Every time Rebecca smiled at him, every time she got excited about helping someone, he fell a little more in love with her. It all came to a head on a warm evening in June. They'd been working late at the foundation, reviewing applications for a second shelter location. Rebecca was sitting on the floor of James's office, surrounded by papers, her shoes kicked off. "We should do it," she said suddenly. "The building on Maple Street. It's perfect. 3 stories right near the bus line." James smiled. "It needs a lot of renovation. But it'll be worth it," Rebecca insisted. "We could house 50 people there, James. 50 more people off the streets." "You're right," James said softly. "You're always right about these things," Rebecca laughed. "I'm not always right. You talked me out of that terrible color scheme I wanted, remember? The purple and orange. It was creative." "It was a nightmare," James said, laughing. Then his expression grew serious. "Rebecca, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Are you happy? Really happy? With the foundation, with this work?" Rebecca looked at him surprised. "James, I've never been happier in my life. Why are you asking?" James walked over to where she was sitting. He lowered himself to the floor beside her, his knees protesting. "Because I need to know that you're here because you want to be," James said quietly. "Not because you feel obligated." "I don't feel obligated," Rebecca said, confused. "James, what's this about?" He took a deep breath. "I need to tell you something, and I'm terrified it's going to ruin everything we've built together. But I can't keep it inside anymore." Rebecca's heart started pounding. "Okay, I'm in love with you," James said. "I've been in love with you for months, and I know it's wrong. I know I'm too old for you, that people will judge us. But I can't help it, Rebecca. You've brought light back into my life." He looked down at his hands. "I understand if this makes you uncomfortable. If you want to leave the foundation, I'll make sure you're taken care of financially. If you want to stay but keep things professional, I'll respect that. I just needed you to know the truth. The office was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Rebecca stared at James, her mind reeling. He loved her. James loved her. The man who'd become her best friend, her partner, the person she thought about first thing in the morning and last thing at night. Say something, James whispered, still not looking at her. Please. Rebecca reached out and placed her hand over his. He looked up, surprised, and found tears in her eyes. You're not too old, she said softly, and I don't care what people think. James, I've been so confused these past few months because I've been falling in love with you too. I kept telling myself it was impossible, that it didn't make sense. But the heart doesn't care about sense, does it? James stared at her, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. You love me? I love you, Rebecca confirmed, and saying it out loud felt like the most honest thing she'd ever said. I love how kind you are, how you listen to people, how you want to make the world better. I love your terrible jokes and the way you put too much sugar in your coffee. I love who I am when I'm with you. Rebecca, James breathed, and then he was cupping her face in his hands, looking at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. Are you sure? Really sure? Because once we cross this line, everything changes, I'm sure, Rebecca said. I've never been more sure of anything. James leaned forward slowly, giving her time to change her mind. But Rebecca didn't pull away. She met him halfway, and when their lips touched, it felt like coming home. The kiss was gentle, tentative, full of months of unspoken feelings finally finding expression. When they pulled apart, both of them were crying and laughing at the same time. This is crazy, Rebecca said, wiping her tears. Completely crazy, James agreed, pulling her close. People are going to talk. Let them talk. Your friends are going to think I'm a gold digger. Then they're not really my friends, James said firmly. Rebecca, I don't care what anyone thinks. You're the best thing that's happened to me in years. If you'll have me, age difference and all, I promise I'll spend every day trying to make you as happy as you've made me. Rebecca looked up at him, at this man who'd transformed from a stranger in rags to the person she couldn't imagine her life without. I'll have you, she said. Every complicated, wonderful bit of you. They sat there on the office floor, surrounded by paperwork for a foundation built on kindness, holding each other and marveling at how one rainy night had led them here. Love didn't always make sense. It didn't follow rules or timelines. It just was. And sometimes that was enough. The next 6 months were the happiest of Rebecca's life. She and James kept their relationship private at first, wanting to enjoy it without outside judgment. They'd have quiet dinners at his house, cook together in his kitchen, and fall asleep watching old movies. But they couldn't hide it forever. People at the foundation started to notice the way they looked at each other. The lingering touches, the inside jokes, the way James's face would light up when Rebecca entered a room. Finally, they decided to be open about their relationship. The reactions were mixed, exactly as expected. Some people were supportive. Others were skeptical. A few of James's old business associates stopped calling. Rebecca overheard whispers at the foundation, speculation about her motives. It hurt, but not as much as she'd thought. James was worth it. Let them talk, James would say, holding her hand. The people who matter will understand. Rebecca's parents were surprisingly accepting. Her mother had worried at first about the age difference, but after meeting James and seeing how happy Rebecca was, she came around. Her father had pulled James aside for what James later described as a very thorough conversation about my intentions. But by dinner's end, even her father was won over. The foundation continued to grow. They opened the second shelter in September, then a third in November. Each had medical facilities, job training programs, and counselors. Rebecca had developed a whole system for helping people transition from the streets to stable housing. The success rate was remarkable. Local media started paying attention. Rebecca gave interviews, keeping the focus on the people they were helping. But inevitably, her relationship with James became part of the story. Some outlets were kind. Others were less generous, questioning whether Rebecca had manipulated a grieving widower. One particularly harsh article appeared in a local tabloid. It painted Rebecca as a gold digger who'd pretended to help a homeless man to trap him. Rebecca tried to brush it off, but James could see it hurt her. Maybe we should have just stayed friends, Rebecca said one evening, looking at the article. James took the tablet from her hands. Rebecca, look at me. Do you love me? Of course I do. And I love you. That's all that matters. Some people will always find reasons to judge. We can't control that. All we can control is how we live our lives. He pulled her close. Besides, you did trap me. You trapped me with your kindness, your compassion, and those terrible singing skills when you think no one's listening. Rebecca laughed. I don't sing that badly. You really do, James said, kissing her forehead. But I love that about you too. As winter approached, James started acting strange. He'd be secretive about phone calls, would disappear to run mysterious errands. Rebecca tried not to read too much into it, but she couldn't help wondering if he was having second thoughts. One evening in early December, James asked Rebecca to dinner at the same restaurant where he'd first proposed the foundation. She dressed carefully, her stomach in knots. This felt like the kind of dinner where big conversations happened. The restaurant looked magical, decorated for the holidays with twinkling lights. James was already there, looking handsome in a dark suit, but he seemed nervous, which made Rebecca more anxious. They made small talk through the appetizers, but Rebecca could tell his mind was elsewhere. James, she finally said, what's going on? You've been acting weird for weeks. James took a deep breath. You're right, I have been, but I needed time to make sure I was doing this right. Doing what right? Instead of answering, James stood up. Then, to Rebecca's shock, he lowered himself onto one knee beside their table. The restaurant went quiet. Rebecca, James began, his voice shaking. 6 months ago, you were a struggling nurse who stopped to help a stranger in the rain. You gave me everything you had, even though you had almost nothing. You saw me as a person when the rest of the world saw nothing. He pulled out a small velvet box. You've given me a reason to live again. You've shown me that love doesn't follow rules or timelines. You've made me happier than I ever thought I could be after losing Catherine. James opened the box, revealing a beautiful ring. Simple but elegant, with a single diamond that caught the light. I know this might seem fast to some people. I know they'll say I'm too old for you. But Rebecca, when you've lived as long as I have, you learn to recognize what matters. And you matter. You're everything that matters. Tears were streaming down Rebecca's face. Around them she could hear other diners sniffling, see phones out recording, but all she could focus on was James. I'm not promising you a perfect life, James continued. I'm not promising that people won't judge us, but I promise I'll love you with everything I have for however long I have. Will you marry me, Rebecca? The restaurant held its breath. Rebecca looked down at James, at this man who'd turned her world upside down in the best possible way. Yes, Rebecca said, her voice barely a whisper. Then louder, yes, of course yes. The restaurant erupted in applause as James stood and slipped the ring onto her finger. He pulled her into his arms and they kissed as cameras flashed. Rebecca didn't care about the cameras or the strangers cheering. All she cared about was this moment, this man, this impossible love story that had started with an act of simple kindness. When they finally pulled apart, James was crying too. I love you, he said. I love you too, Rebecca replied. Even though you're terrible at keeping secrets, James laughed. Was it that obvious? You've been acting suspicious for a month, Rebecca said. I was starting to think you were planning to break up with me. Never, James said firmly. You're stuck with me now. They sat back down at their table, but neither could eat much. They were too busy looking at the ring, at each other, at the future stretching before them. They talked about wedding plans, about whether they wanted something small and private, or if they should include everyone from the foundation. You know, people are going to say things, Rebecca said eventually. The articles are going to get worse before they get better. Let them, James said, holding her hand across the table. We know the truth. We know what we have. That's enough, and it was. The video of the proposal went viral. Some comments were cruel, calling Rebecca opportunistic and James foolish, but there were far more supportive comments. People who found their story romantic and inspiring. People who saw that love was love no matter how or when you found it. The Catherine Foundation continued to thrive. Rebecca and James poured their hearts into it, creating a model that other cities began to replicate. They helped hundreds of people get off the streets, find jobs, rebuild their lives. Rebecca and James got married in the spring, in a small ceremony at the first shelter they'd opened. The residents helped decorate, turning the common room into something beautiful. It wasn't traditional or fancy, but it was perfect. As Rebecca walked down the makeshift aisle, past the people whose lives they'd helped change, toward the man who'd changed her life, she understood something profound. Sometimes the best things in life start when you least expect them. Sometimes helping someone else is the same as helping yourself. Their story proved something important, that kindness matters, that seeing people as human beings changes everything, that one moment of compassion can ripple out in ways you never imagine, and that sometimes the universe rewards those who give without expecting anything in return. Rebecca and James lived happily, building their foundation, helping their community, and loving each other fiercely. They proved that love doesn't care about age, wealth, or what anyone else thinks. And it all started because a broke nurse stopped in the rain to help a stranger. Because she saw a person who needed help and decided that mattered more than getting home dry. Because she chose compassion over convenience. That choice changed 2 lives completely, and in changing those 2 lives, it changed hundreds more. That's the power of kindness. That's the power of love. That's the power of simply choosing to care.